Outside linebacker is the X factor to Washington's defensive success.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hansen. He writes with me over at Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Just a quick reminder to all you everydayers out there, wherever you get this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, we're there, we're everywhere. Make sure you click that subscribe button, click that little bell as well, so you never miss when we post a new episode. And if you're on the audio only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as it all helps the program out a lot. Now, Lars, we got a really fun show that we want to dive into this season. We're going to talk about some of the biggest sleepers on the roster that even you and I may have overlooked over the course of this wonderful, way too long offseason. We can't wait to get back out to fall camp at the end of the month, but that's a story for another day, because we want to talk about outside linebacker. We want to talk about defensive coordinator Ryan Walters and why he should be trusted to help develop this position. And we also just want to talk about why it's so important to defensive success in this scheme.
Because Jedd Fisch created an entire new position coach for it. If you also think about that layer to it, where Aaron Van Horn's now your outside linebackers coach. Last year, it was Jason Cavusi along the entire defensive line. And I think with the evolution of college football and you bringing over a former head coach and Ryan Walters to basically be the head coach of your defense, you want to invest those resources and say, Ryan, you have every tool at your disposal to make this defense go, so I don't have to give 2 cents about it. In terms of my actual thought process, Pat John can pay more than 2 cents to figure it out, but I don't really want to have to. And that's exactly how it should be. And I think that's what's been so intriguing about this, because when you go down the list of guys like we were going through before the show, it's like, well, who do you have? Oh, actually, he is an edge. Oh, he is an outside linebacker. Oh, you did convert these guys and that sort of thing. And it becomes a case of there's so much potential at the position, but because of the way last season transpired, we can't go into it saying, hey, this guy, there's a potential Braylon Trace on the roster, but we can't definitively go into the season and say, hey, there's your 8 to 10 sack a season guy, or even a 5 sack a season guy, because Zach Durfee was hurt last season for most of it. And so there's plenty of potential, but we still haven't all seen that come to fruition just yet.
So I'm sure the first time you said the word potential, every single everydayer who's listening to the show right now said, oh, they're talking about Zach Durfee. Because we are, where he is one of the most vital pieces to success of just this defensive scheme as a whole. You and I have spent a lot of time talking about how much the interior of this defensive line has truly improved. When you think about the transfer portal and guys like Taitai Uyunglele, who I considered having a small note about him in this episode, but because he is such a versatile guy, but I think he is going to play more on the defensive, just on the interior of the defensive line. Plus, Antario Thompson, Simone Peppa, the way Armand Parker looked during spring camp, the depth on the interior has truly improved. And I think that if Russell Davis and Isaiah Ward are healthy, and if Zach Durfee is healthy, you're going to see a much better season from the defensive line. But this is why we want to talk about outside linebacker, and more specifically Zach Durfee. Is you said it perfectly. The potential is there for him to be unlocked and to find success and win those one-on-one matchups if you're able to stay on the field, because we saw it last season. We saw what kind of potential he does hold. And this is something where you look at Washington's just true numbers from last season. Yes, in a slightly different scheme, under a different defensive coordinator, you were only able to record 20 sacks, which was 15th in the Big Ten. And now I just look at how Ryan Walters has found different ways, and I want to dive into this a little bit more later on as well, but how he has found different ways to make sure that you can get these different players into advantageous situations and get them to success. Where I look at guys at Purdue like Nick Scorton, who's now in the NFL after transferring to Texas A&M, and like Will Heldt as well, who just transferred to Purdue from Clemson after Ryan Walters got fired following the end of the 2024 season. So there are some good examples in terms of Ryan Walters being able to coach these guys into success and find ways to just utilize their athleticism, utilize their individual skill sets, and find different ways for them to succeed. And I think Zach Durfee is the most intriguing in certainly just in that discussion, because we've heard it for 2 years now. And now it's, if that guy can stay on the field and stay healthy for, 12, 13, 14 games, however many Washington ends up playing this season, like that is such a huge advantage for what this defense could look like.
And if you think about also what we got to realize Zach Durfee, when he didn't play last season, the impact that it had was also in the run game. And that's another element to this because when you mentioned Russell Davis, more of a speed rusher, not that he can't, hold up against the run, but just I think that would be maybe a part of his game that he would want to develop, in the 25 season and that sort of thing. But Durfee was a guy where you could just see, he actually does hold up really well against the run.
Yeah.
When he plays. And that was that thing, once you got into mid-October and, certainly November, you could kind of see, that's not necessarily there anymore. But, that's why this is so important, is because it's not just getting after the quarterback. Because you mentioned, you have the interior guys as well to push the pocket as well. And you're talking about creating one-on-one matchups. That's what the defense does. What Ryan Walters is emphasizing. How do I create a one-on-one matchup with Zach Durfee, a tight end, or Zach Durfee, and, can we, come up with a few different ways to use him where you're not just saying, we're just going to go edge. It's how do you actually utilize their athleticism, like you mentioned, not just rushing traditional edges straight from the outside.
So that's where guys like Russell Davis and Isaiah Ward and Jacob Lane falls into this discussion for me as well, where I'm curious to see what the plan is going to be with them. Because you mentioned it. Jedd Fisch did say last season, defending the run right now is not something we're, really planning on with Isaiah Ward because he's a little too light for that right now. That's not in his skill set, which, you want to make sure you continue to emphasize and develop over the course of the offseason. And that's one thing I'm very curious to see what it looks like coming into fall camp. But I look at this room as a whole and I say, you have, when you talk about some of these more dedicated pass rushers, you have the potential to find ways to, I don't want to say be a true game wrecker, because we did see, Russell Davis get a 3-sack game last season, which is the definition of that. But it's always just unfair to hold somebody that standard week in and week out. But I look at what you can do with so many of these different guys. And like you said, combined with what you're going to be getting on the interior, a stable, deep rotation of guys who I don't know if any one of them are going to have more than, let's just say 3 or 4 sacks this season. Let's be real about that. But if you're creating opportunities and finding ways for these guys on the outside to win against tackles, against tight ends, against whoever is across from them, that's exactly what you're looking for, to just find ways to put more pressure on the quarterback, to blow up more running lanes, which is something we didn't see at all last year. There's just so few negative plays generated by this defense, and a lot of that does come from a lack of depth. But it's why, it's a fun stat that I like to look at. There have been 3 positions that have been selected number 1 overall by the NFL in the last 20, 25 years, I think it is. It's quarterback, it's offensive tackle, it's edge rusher. Because those are positions that are going to impact the game the most. And if, even if it's not Zach Durfee, even if somebody else steps up and you find a way to just get some sort of production from that position, that is going to help this defense take such a big step forward that, down the stretch, like I think about the Oregon game, I think about the Penn State game, when whoever was sitting back there playing quarterback through that back half of the season, you knew that they were going to have time to throw. And it wasn't just because of the defensive line or the interior of the defensive line. It was because you weren't able to beat anybody off the edge and force any kind of pressure on opposing quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case of kind of like what we're saying, where you have volume in numbers, so the numbers will come. Like the sack numbers should come. It might not be one guy having more than 6. I would put the over-under at 6.5 for a individual, but I would put the team number at 25, 30 in terms of potential, because you could have 4 or 5 guys with 4 or 5 sacks, or 3, 4 or 5 sacks, and all of a sudden now you're thinking, wow, we don't have a big game record, but we have so many different types of game records that we can still actually see an improvement at the position compared to last season, where if the number is still in the low 20s, like below 24, 25, like that to me is still concerning given what you invested in the position, both coaching staff and player on the rosters. That to me would be a concern. But I just, again, barring injury, I just don't see, because you have so much depth, like we've talked about, I just don't see how at least 2 of those guys don't pop for a dozen combined. And like that to me is how you get to the number eventually, where you're not looking at one guy, because then you don't have to game plan against just one guy. You're figuring out, well, how do we match up against this? That creates opposing problems for offense, and that's what you're looking for.
Exactly. It's about creating just a solid rotation when you don't have, like, I do believe that Zach Durfee has that high-end potential, but we haven't seen it yet. So it's unfair to just say, oh yeah, we expect this guy to take that big jump. We thought it was going to happen last year. We just saw how that turned out, which is unfortunate. And, like obviously nobody's ever rooting for injuries or rooting for anything like that. But if you're able to develop a strong rotation behind him, which is not something we saw last season due to a host of injuries, it's a concern. And it's something that you need to figure out how to write. And I think bringing Ryan Walters on board was a genius decision in that regard. And we'll get to that right after a message from our good friends over at Game Time. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize that you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Game Time makes it possible. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch, and they've got incredible last minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. And Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, making it easy to browse the app for an exciting upcoming MLB game, which is literally what I just did this morning before we sat down to record this show. I just got back from watching the Seattle Mariners take on the Pittsburgh Pirates because I wanted to see Paul Skeens in action, and I'm so glad I got to do that with Game Time's exclusive zone deals. Shout out to Game Time for that. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So Lars, you and I have talked a lot about Ryan Walters and what he can do for this defense. And I threw a couple of names out there earlier. I wanted to come back around to a couple of those guys because you and I were kind of going over the depth at this outside linebacker position right before we clicked record. And it was, okay, the depth right there is solid. You have a couple of guys where it's clear what you see in, some of the younger players on the roster of Victor Sanchez-Hernandez and Devin Hyde. It might take a year or two for some of these guys to pop and to truly turn into what you might expect. But like we said in the first segment, there are so many just different intriguing skill sets on this roster where you like the way the puzzle pieces fit together. And I think when you go back and you look at what Ryan Walters was able to do to develop some of these guys at Purdue, like we saw Nick Scorton, I believe he led the whole Big Ten in sacks in 2023 because of what Ryan Walters was able to just help him unlock. And, it's why we're saying like, oh yeah, if this guy gets 6 or 7 sacks, like, we're saying the scheme can certainly play a big part in that. But I think Ryan Walters, when you talk about what he did with Nick Scorton, what he did with a guy like Will Heldt, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, who's at Clemson this upcoming season, he was able to help them unlock their skill set and able to help them take the next step. And it's something where we look around this roster and it's a whole bunch of that. It's a whole bunch of this guy, you see what he has. You see what, to bring it back to Russell Davis. We saw what he has on the high end last season. Now, how can you unlock that consistently? And I think that what he's shown throughout his career puts him in a really great spot to help this room take a big step forward this season.
Absolutely. And I think, and we're going to keep repeating it, but like that's why you went and evaluated Ryan Walters and had him be the choice. And as Jedd mentioned during his press conference when Ryan was introduced, yeah, there was a lot of reported candidates, but clearly Jedd targeted Ryan Walters for a reason. And I think this was it. Like, Jedd's not clueless. Like, I know it might, some fans were like, oh, how is he not changing things? Like, well, you kind of have to wait till the offseason to change it. And now the frustrating part about what fans are going to hear now is, well, now you got to wait till the season, wait till after fall camp, wait till one more time. But everything is there. And I think, like a guy that you mentioned before, Deshawn Lynch, like there's so much intrigue there. A guy like Hayden Moore, where you're flipping him from inside linebacker to outside linebacker. You're not just doing that for a body. You got walk-ons. You could easily, if you wanted to, have him not be, because you brought him into the program under Robert Bala. So Jedd obviously, and Matt Doherty assessed that talent and thought he was worthy of coming in the program. So him moving to the position, what do you see there? Is he even going to be more of a speed rusher or the Russell Davis type? Like, what are you because there's, like you mentioned, there's so many different bodies that you can use in so many different ways. That's why Ryan Walters is one of the best defensive coordinators, if not, as Jedd said, the best defensive coordinator in the country. That's why you go out and hire that guy, because you have all the resources. You have, for the most part, the talent. And the talent that you didn't have, you now have. Ideally, you're probably going to want to add some more to that in 26. But for 25, you're looking at thinking, we have plenty to go with. We have plenty of horses. It's not for a lack of bodies. It's now, how do we unlock these horses and let the Clydesdales run?
So I love where you go with that, because you threw me the lob and I have to throw it down when you're talking about all of that and how it relates to Deshawn Lynch, which is somebody who I, as the everydayers know, I was very high on coming into last season, because at 6'4", 6'5", close to 300 pounds, he was a really good athlete for his size. I will always think of, there was one play where he was, you already know what I'm talking about here, where he was on the other side of the field. We saw Damon Williams roll out to his right and just go and turn on the jets, and he's 15, 20 yards downfield. And all of a sudden we see this massive human just really start to close in on him. And we were like, who's it? Oh, it's Deshawn Lynch. Like, he's got that level of high-end athleticism that you might not expect. And it was something where last year, I know I talked about it a lot on the show, I believed that he was going to find a way to succeed on the interior. And we didn't necessarily see that step forward. And it's something where during his final season at Sac State, he was playing a lot of outside linebacker. And it feels like he's going to really just move back to that role in a full-time capacity this upcoming season, which is great when, you mentioned in the first segment, talking about setting the edge and run defense. And this is why I wanted to bring up some of those other guys that Ryan Walters has helped unlock, because it's one of those things where we saw it in a couple different points last year. And I was really intrigued by it, where he was just that, where Steve Belichick would go to those NASCAR zero down front packages, and he was lined up over the center, and you tried to find ways to take advantage of that athleticism. And I think we might see some of those similar things this year, because when you throw on that Purdue tape, that's something that I talked about with Derek Coleman-Broussard on the show, where we saw Nick Scorton doing that. And we saw some of those guys just find ways to succeed in that Purdue scheme, just being able to take advantage of their athleticism from different alignments along the defensive front. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm really curious to watch as we get into fall camp and as we get into the season. It's, can you get a guy like that who we know can be a solid edge setter because of the size and physicality that he brings to the table? Can you find ways to unlock a little bit of extra pass rush juice, and maybe vice versa with somebody like Jacob Lane, who I think is a pretty solid run defender already, but can you find ways to just help him kick it into that next gear, which is something we know that both the Kalen DeBoer staff and this Jedd Fisch coaching staff believe he can continue to achieve, because we saw him play a lot in 2023. And then we saw him still find ways onto the field consistently last season as well. And I'm curious to see how that's going to work out. And I think that that's something that is really exciting to think about with Ryan Walters, is he can find ways to get those guys into advantageous situations.
Perfect phrasing on that, because one guy that we haven't mentioned that literally just came to me as we're saying all this, but we've talked about a couple of times before. What about using X-Ray Alexander as a pass rusher? Like, not as a true pass rusher, but as a guy that could, be that extra guy, maybe a delayed blitzer type of thing, where, again, you have so many different types of bodies. And I think that's something worth covering here for 30 seconds here. Ryan Walters doesn't need just one type of body. He hasn't had success with just one type of, edge rusher, where you have different types of guys, different types of sizes. One might be a true speed rusher. One might be a combo, a guy that can hold up against the run, like a Zach Durfee, where you're not just saying, oh, he's an edge rusher, pass rusher specialist, where, if the spin move doesn't work and the bull rush doesn't work, you're hopeless. It's no, like, I am going to find a way to get my guys impacted. And I think X-Ray is kind of that X factor in the room, along with the Jacob Lane. Like, again, you are at a nauseum of riches compared to last season in terms of what you can do and who you can bring. But again, like Brian says, it's not just a 5-1-5. It's a 4-2-5, 4-1. There's, again, because he wants to have a multiple defense, you have a multitude of ways that you can use different guys. And so, yes, we're talking about true outside linebackers here in the show, but X is a guy who could be that true tweener type of guy.
No, I agree, because we saw that. We saw that during spring practice, where there were times where he'd walk down from his inside linebacker spot to that wide 9 outside linebacker sort of alignment. And you're right. And it's just an interesting wrench in all this, where it's, how often are we going to see that? How often are you going to see it with that guy versus somebody I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, a Deven Bryant, versus how often are you going to just throw one of your true outside linebackers out there, whether it be, a name we haven't mentioned yet in Hayden Moore, or, let's say it is Russell Davis or Isaiah Ward. And it's, we want to make sure that these guys continue to see an uptick in snaps, because we, don't want to just show that it's so obvious, like, oh, these guys are only out there when we're rushing the passer versus these guys are only out there when we're trying to stop the run. So there are so many different little variances that I don't think have been worked out yet. And this is why we wanted to talk about this. There's just so many different little things that haven't been worked out yet, which in my opinion is a good thing, because there is so much more depth on this roster, especially along the defensive line for this upcoming season. We know that there are still some things that need to be worked out in the long term, like you said, but you look at where this roster is sitting right now, and it's a point we've tried to hammer home on this year program of the depth is there to be an average to slightly above average defensive line. And if somebody takes that next step forward and you are able to push it into the top, just top 6, top 5 in the conference, great. Of course, you're going to be happy with that. And that's, again, this is why we keep coming back to this point of there's so much depth along the defensive line. You want to see just somebody take that step forward. And I truly believe we're going to see that this season. But Lars, speaking of taking a step forward, there are a couple of guys that I think you and I need to do a better job of really making sure that the everydayers know they're going to have a big year. Let's start on the offensive side. I'm just going to hand it over to you. Who do you got?
So it's a guy that not necessarily we haven't beat the drum before, and certainly I haven't. I've beaten this drum many times already, but it's Max McCree, because the reason why I would say he slept on is how he ended last season. Obviously, the thumb injury at Iowa did not help things, and
yeah,
I know I don't want to say I was a victim of it, but I think a lot of people are like, oh, it's just a dislocated thumb. Why is this like a 4 or 5 week thing? It's like, well, like as a left tackle or offensive lineman, like you kind of need your hands, or you can't just. You can't just do the punching bag thing and have that be a day. But I think, honestly, giving Max last season those mental reps in Jedd's system, where I was looking on the sideline at Iowa, it was at Penn State, or I think at Oregon even. There was a couple of games where you could see Max taking those mental reps just on the sideline. You're like saying, like, hey, like I'm still trying to, be up to this, because this season you have Carver, Willis, and Drew Azzopardi, probably your 2 starting left and right tackles respectively. But we saw last season, you're probably going to need 4. So just, 2 on each side. And on top of that, we saw the 6 offensive linemen be a real key last season. And obviously you added to the tight end room, so you might not need that as much as you had last season. But I think Max is a guy where you look at, he's got the JUCO All-American, resume. He's got the potential. He's got the Big Ten experience, like we mentioned in Maryland before. But then, with the time off away from football, last season was kind of a let's get back into football. And now I think, he strikes me as a guy where this is his season, to kind of make the bread. Last season was you secured the bread. Now you're going to actually make the bread. You're going to put everything together. And whether he starts or not to begin the season, I wouldn't be surprised if Max, kind of pushes his way into a role, whether it's a starting role or just a significant contributor role by, call it, mid to late September.
Yeah, absolutely. I like where you're going with that, because that's one of the things that we wanted to make sure we highlight is guys who, one of the guys I have is going to be a starter. One of them is probably going to be a rotational piece, but it's just guys who are going to find ways to contribute on this roster in one way or another. And like you said, if Max McCree is not a starting tackle come August 30th, when Washington plays the first game, we're not going to be shocked, because it seems like the offensive line, for the most part, is getting closer to being set. But having a guy like that who does have experience at both tackle spots right now, and, if somebody needs to come out for a series, or, somebody ends up getting injured, having somebody like that with a little bit of experience under their belt last year. And I think it's one of the things about Max that we did see last season is that the flashes were there. It was okay. Yeah. Like, I remember, I feel like it was early on in the Michigan game. There were certain points where it's okay. Yeah. I see why they took this guy, and obviously it took him a while to get up to weight, to get into football playing shape. And it's, that's all okay for the situation that he was in, which is obviously out of everybody's control. But it's one of those things where you do have to be a little bit patient with that. And it's something where, yeah, if somebody has to miss a game or two this season and Max McCree slides in as a starter and performs adequately, you're really happy with the depth along this offensive line, which, as we spent the rest of the show talking about on the defensive line, was something you did not have last year. My guy is also along the offensive line, and he's somebody who I always feel like we'll kind of mention in passing, but haven't done a good job of really diving in on, because I honestly, I don't have a good reason why. Like, the more we talk about it, it's kind of like, oh yeah, we know he's going to be there. We know he has a spot secured. And that's Landen Hatchett, where we look at what Landen brought to the table last year, 8 months off of a torn ACL. I think he'd be the first person to tell you that he has a long way to go to continue to improve. But like I said, 8 months post torn ACL, getting out there and playing in 13 games in a college football season is a feat in and of itself. And it's one of those things where I feel like, again, this is why we maybe haven't talked about him as much. It's whenever we bring up Landen Hatchett, it's always, oh yeah, he had the knee injury last year and he was trying to work his way back into shape. He was trying to do this, he was trying to do that. But I think it's something where when you and I talked to him in the spring, you think about the leadership role that he's taken on in the middle of that offensive line, and just with the experience that he gained, and not just last year, but as a true freshman as well. You can just look at the situation that he's coming into this season at his natural position and say, yeah, this is a guy who certainly just seems ready to take that big step forward. And having just a steadying presence in the middle is, I just think, would be such a win for this offensive line.
And a guy who already knows Jedd's offense, a guy who spent a year in Jedd's offense. So with Carver coming in and, Drew trying to, get a full season now, it's like having that anchor in the middle of the offensive line, I think is so paramount, because when we talk about, the struggles of the offensive line, it wasn't Landen. But it wasn't Landen. Like when he was in, the Landen wasn't the issue. And that's just all we're going to say on that matter. Because, with Landen, I think this offseason, from what I've seen from him and just kind of everything, it's almost like, okay, last year was almost, again, separate from Max, but just kind of like the reset. You're like, let me prove that I can, get into this and, get it back from the knee. Because, like we were both surprised when Jedd told me at the Big Ten Media Day, oh, by the way, Landen going to be ready at the start of fall camp. I'm like,
yeah.
And now again, was he not? He was, but again, there was like a week ramp up here. But again, compared, to when the surgery happened and all that, it was still way ahead of time in terms of what we expected. And so I think now, without any limitations, his brother Gearin coming back, always nice to have the brother back in the fold. So I think, the family, everything is kind of trending up for Landen. But the reason why he's a sleeper is, are you hearing anything about him on like second, third team list? Any
No.
But do you think by the end of the season you will?
It's possible. It's very possible.
I think that he has, because we know he has that potential, which is why he played as a freshman in Ryan Grubb's system. Like,
yes,
because we know, like, okay, that coaching staff believed in him so early. It's like clearly Jedd, is going to. And so I think it's a matter of just giving him that whole another full year to say, hey, look, this is who I am. And then again, if you want to come back for next season, great. But the point in that is to say, like, you cannot replace a guy like Landen Hatchett, especially along the offensive line. He's just a guy from personality and playing. You can't replicate that.
Absolutely. So before we get out of here, let's hop over to the defensive side. We picked one guy on each side of the ball. Do you want to start? Do you want me to start? Because
I'll let you start.
Okay. No, that's perfect. So my guy was Deven Bryant. And I was really glad that you brought up X-Ray Alexander when you did a few minutes ago, because it was something where I think this is something we might have mentioned at some point during spring practice. It's, in the absence of Jacob Manu, Deven Bryant hasn't just hung around with the first team defense. He has made himself indisposable, where he's somebody who, is a little bit undersized, but always just found ways to be around the football. And he played that same sort of role that X-Ray Alexander did at times, where he was playing inside linebacker. He was playing outside linebacker. And I think, you and I have not done the best job of talking about him, because you and I will sit here and just say, well, how does Jacob Manu factor into all this? Which is a completely fair argument on the other side of things. But it's what Jedd Fisch has always talked about with breeding that just layer of competition. You want to see that every single day at every single position. And if, Jacob Manu is healthy and ready to play, but you also have somebody in Deven Bryant who can continue to contribute alongside a preseason second team all Big Ten guy in Buda Alukta and X-Ray Alexander, who, as you alluded to, is going to be a critical, versatile piece of this defense, where he is going to play some outside linebacker. He is going to play a little bit on the inside as well, depending on just the offense and the personnel and different things like that. Having another guy in that rotation is so important for this run defense, which was not good last year. You allowed 161.8 yards per game. You were 15th in the Big Ten in that metric. And having, obviously, a strong defensive line is crucial to that. But having a rotation of 2, 3, 4, 5 linebackers, where it was something we didn't necessarily see last year either, where, having a couple of awesome experienced guys in Carson Bruner and Alfonso Tupatala can certainly cover up a lot. And when you had somebody like Kamori House, who was able to just come in and contribute right away as a true freshman, that's great. But if you have a deep, stable rotation at that position as well, that it'll show this fall why you were able to go out and invest in that, as well as invest in the defensive line.
And I couldn't agree with that anymore. And I think a guy in that similar mold that you would look at would be Leroy Bryant, and a guy that you don't necessarily expect like this season to be a starter. I know next season you've already pegged him as the cornerback 2 opposite of Dylan Robinson, which I don't blame you for, because I just want to give you props for calling that right now, because I know when it comes to fruition, it will, we want to come back.
I'll be clipping that
on July 6th and about 20 other episodes before that. But the reason why is, like, I remember talking to, I think, Steve Stiles, one of his old, position coaches, from, his high school training days. And it was just like his mindset and like just the way he prepares the game, the way he approaches, the way he plays physically outside and able to hold up. I think learning from Takario, learning another season from Ephesians Price, but especially like, Takario as well, where you can just look and say, like, again, Takario 6'4", he's kind of a man of its own. So he's not, Leroy can't, say, hey, I'm 6'4", but I think he does play above his height at 6'1". And so I think a guy that this season should absolutely be in the mix. Now, do you end up slotting him in a nickel, with Rashawn Clark? Because there's so many different ways you could put him, where we saw last season, he kind of lined up a little bit inside, mostly outside in reserve time.
I think he's better on the outside.
And I agree too. But again, because of that size, I wonder, getting back to the theme of Ryan Walters here, like Ryan Walters can cook with defensive backs. So I'm not worried about where Leroy ends up playing inside or outside. But I think if he's able to get enough of a running start this season behind Takario and Ephesians, that starting season next year will be way more advanced than if he gets kind of what he got last season, which was, 200, 250 snaps-ish, give or take, maybe in that ballpark. Now, again, hard to take Takario and Ephesians off the field in that sense. But I think that's, again, the onus on Walters to, hey, if we're locking things down and Jedd's got a decent score, let's put Leroy in if we're up 2 scores. Just give him some tests where it's not garbage time and you can still go against the number 1 or a number 2. So he's not, kind of fresh out of the water going into 26.
So I was hoping we could wrap it up on that note, but I have a bold prediction. I think we're going to end up seeing him play more snaps last year than we did this season. And because I like where you're going with that. And it just kind of hit me as you were saying that, and it's like you said, it's not a knock on Takario on Leroy to have Takario and Ephesians in the building, but it's just one of those things where you look at the future, and it's something you and I have been talking about with Dylan Robinson, or if he plays in every game this season, we're not going to be surprised. And if, we see certain alignments with both of those guys out there and Takario and Ephesians get a breather for a couple of plays, I'm not going to be super shocked by that. Is that, necessarily the best strategy that fans are going to be super happy with? Maybe not, but you're going to find ways to try to make that work, because that is the long-term future of your defense right there, where you look at 2026 and beyond. So you'd want to make sure that those guys are on the field together at certain points. And, obviously to keep your starters and what I believe is going to be the best tandem of corners in the Big Ten healthy. But if we see those two guys on the field a little bit more often, I'm not going to be shocked, because Leroy does have that high end potential. And we saw it this spring. I loved how aggressive he was with receivers, where they were still, 10, 12 yards downfield. And he was making sure that whoever he was across from, they were feeling his presence. And it's a lot of fun to just think about what that is going to be like going down the road. But Lars, with that being said, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all everydayers for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout the offseason. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast. So that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So make sure you click that like button, click that little bell, so you never miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Wednesday.